For the most updated version of the Glyphs RPG blueprint, tokens, accessories and resources, please visit www.glyphsrpg.com. Also visit 2ddice.com for our internationally popular D20 RPG coins and our other masterful coin works.
Greetings, travelers and architects. It's Charlie again. So today we're going to get into chapter 15 of the blueprint, which deals with structure. So what do I mean by structure? We're going to talk about the physical composition of a character, so an NPC, a player character, and we're also going to talk about how monsters are created in terms of their physical attributes. Okay, we're going to talk about monsters in a different chapter, but this is intended to basically give you an overview of why the damage system is the way it is. Okay, a little bit more realism. We're going to go over some optional sustenance metrics that are designed to use, at your will if you want to incorporate them into your game for more realism. Okay, we're going to talk about those. Very optional, but definitely nice to have on hand. We're going to go over some status elements, and first I want to start off by going over the different bodily makeups of a being, I guess you could say. So bear with me here. So let's go down. So the first structural makeup that we're going to go over is tissue. So your skin, your muscles, the exterior layer of flesh, right? That's the first bodily layer that we're dealing with, okay? Now, some forms of tissue can mimic armor, but generally we're talking biological flesh. So page 264 is what we're reading, so if you want to pick up there, that's great. So in Glyphs, let me scroll down here. This laptop's slow today. Okay, so in Glyphs, we basically look at 4 different types of tissue. So organic tissue, synthetic, elemental, and etheric. So organic is flesh and blood, just like a regular person, okay? Synthetic would be, silicone or something artificial that generally pertains to robots, androids, cyborgs, things of that nature. Elemental, it would apply to like elemental creatures, and it's basically made of the element that it's composed of, I guess you could say. So, with elemental tissue, it's nice because it can only be affected by certain elemental properties versus the other ones. Organic tissue can be damaged by pretty much anything, okay, as an example. And then finally we have etheric tissue. So creatures that have an etheric bodily tissue, basically, they can only be damaged, that type of tissue can only be inflicted with magical weapons or anything that can damage etheric forces, I guess you could say. So that's kind of how we look at things here. So again, this isn't meant to complicate things or overwhelm you with all kind of options. This is just there so you kind of see how things go into play when you're creating a monster, those of you architects out there, okay? That's what this is for, okay? Next, bodily layer, we're going to talk about skeletons. So bones, things of that nature, okay? So the skeleton controls movement, okay? That's essentially what we're looking at here. So the first type of skeleton is your typical endoskeleton, okay? Just like you and I have, okay? Internal bone structure that affects movement. If something breaks in your skeleton, chances are you're not going to be able to move that particular bodily section, okay? If the skeleton is breached, chances are the vital organ is going to be made vulnerable, okay? So again, things to keep in mind when your character is dealing damage to a monster or is dealt damage, okay? That's what this is intended for. So we have exoskeleton, we have, endoskeleton here, exoskeleton, okay? So creatures that basically have an exterior shell of bone or an armor-like exoskeleton, that's what this is for. So, some of them can even mimic the properties of armor. You can give it its own armor points and everything. Talk about monsters later on, but that's a form of skeleton. And then finally we have something like we call network. So, you're a robotic creature that's made of, wires inside. There's no real bone structure inside, but wires, a network of sorts that if that's damaged, that could also affect movement and so forth. So just keep that in mind here. Again, take your time, scroll through it at your leisure. Finally here, this is very important. We get to vitals. So flesh basically is your exterior bodily structure. Skeleton affects your movement and can house vitals. And finally we have vitals here. Okay, if any vital organ is damaged, that's generally when a character dies or starts to die, as we're going to see here shortly. So when we talk about damage in the damage system here, the tissue can take a lot of abuse. Skeleton to a certain point is stronger, but if it's compromised, again, it can affect movement and so forth. But vital organs, you're talking about serious death, maiming, sensory issues, depending on what's hit. So let's see. Now, the first form of vital organs we consider, obviously, are biological. This annoying thing again. Let me shut this down. Okay. So biological organs, again, just like human beings have, and most race types out there are going to have biological organs. Okay, so page 269 has a quick chart here of kind of a breakdown of vitals. So depending on which biological vital is stricken and if its LHP is depleted, it's going to give you the effect that you're going to have here. Okay, so if somebody gets shot in the head and their LHP, their brain's LHP is depleted, okay, that's an instant kill. Okay, or if you're using the unconscious rules, if it applies, it would be an instant KO. Okay, if you're going for that scenario. But here you'll see some examples of what happens if an organ's LHP is depleted. So very important, again, this is a realistic damage system designed to emphasize more strategy and combat. So that's why this is how it is. So take a look here at the different effects. Okay. So next we have artificial and energy vitals. So artificial vitals are pretty self-explanatory. So robotic organs, people that are cyborgs, they've been augmented with artificial vitals. This gives you an example, a description of what they do, and again, what happens if their LHP is depleted. Same thing for energy. Now, energy vitals, I guess you could think of them as chakras, different energy centers on an etheric being, if you will. So, a ghost might have energy vitals. Again, it all depends on you, the architect, and how you want to look at things when you're creating different beings. Okay, so just something to consider here. But as an example, and a creature with energy vitals can't be damaged by physical means. You would need a magic weapon or an elemental force to actually damage that vital organ. So, some demigods may have that type of structure. Again, it's all relative on you, the architect, how you want to incorporate these. But again, this is just there mostly for information, okay? Okay, so on page 271, we get into blood. Now, this is a great optional metric to include. Again, not just for more realism, but for combat that may be a little bit more drawn out, or if a character maybe survives the encounter, but has been wounded to such a degree where he needs, quick attention before he bleeds out. I don't use this metric a lot. Battles in pretty quickly, just based on the decision my folks make. But if you have situations to where it's important, then by all means, it's definitely nice to have on hand. So blood. Now here on page 272, you'll see a chart here that's got units that belong to different being sizes. Okay, so as an example, a medium-sized being, which is your average human. So a human would have 12 units of blood in Glyphs. That's what we look at. So this will give you the different default units here. And this section here tells you what happens if a certain percentage of units are lost in battle, okay? So as an example, if you got a guy who's taken some serious damage but is still alive for the moment, right? Then if he's bled out and lost about half his blood, this is what happens, okay? He's very weak, he's very incoherent. -2 goes to all physique and intelligence attributes off the bat, and all modifiers are nullified. So this guy here, even if you reach half your blood loss, you're in really bad shape here, and it just gets worse from there. Okay, so that's pretty much covers the basics. Now, in this next segment, we're going to talk a little bit more about sustenance and how you could apply that. So on page 273, we're going to go overview of the sustenance metrics. Now, those are nice and very handy metrics to have if you choose to incorporate them in your campaign. Again, depending on how much. It's more about consequence, right? I don't necessarily use these for every campaign or every setting, but it depends on where my players are headed. They're in the middle of a desert, or they're fighting, in a really dark setting, and they got nasty weather and it's just really hot. I don't know, effects it could have on their well-being. So in situations like that, you definitely want to consider using sustenance metrics. Okay, let's say you've got characters wandering, in the forest and they haven't eaten for a couple days. Okay, how would you simulate that in the glyph system? That's the things we're going to consider here. So again, these are very optional. They're on page 2 of the character booklet if you want to use them or not, but they're definitely there, and like I said, they are very nice to have. Okay, kind of changes the flow of things from just hack and slash, so very handy. So which sustenance metrics do we look at here in glyphs? So first we have nutrition, then we have hydration, okay, then we have recovery and perseveration, okay. So let's see, or preservation, yeah, I can't read today, preservation, okay. Let's go here, so let's go down to sustenance. So let's take a glance at these. So nutrition, okay, pretty idiot proof, okay, food. Does your character have enough food? Have they eaten enough? Are they starving? Okay, what happens if they're hungry? That's what we're looking at here with this metric. So on page 2 of your character booklet, you'll see percentages, okay, 100%, okay, everything's great. But if you fall below 100% on any of these, you'll start to see effects happen. So if you're at 75%, okay, you start to get hungry and your character would start looking for food. So the architect would tell the character that, and their priority should be looking for food at that point. So again, you only want to use these if the situation and the environment calls for it, but definitely a nice game changer here. So let's say a character is at 50% of their nutrition level, now they're starving, okay? And the effects of starvation begin to set in depending on the character's race type. And when that happens, guess what? All modifiers become 0, okay? That really sucks, but, again, you can do it if you need to. Okay, finally, you got a character who's at 25% of their nutrition level, where they should be. They become famished at that point, okay? So that would mean all of their physique and intelligence attributes suffer -3 on each of them. And death can occur within number 1 day. So number 1, remember, spin the token, okay? Spin it, anything you see a number, you spin it and you interpret the digits. So spin, okay, I spun it, whatever, and it lands on here. So number 2, so that would be 2 days. So death can occur within 2 days if they don't eat. That's at this point, okay? So that's what this means, okay? Now, I'm not going to read through everything. That's kind of a waste of time, but just kind of gives you an idea of how this works. So hydration, same thing applies, except we're dealing with, water, sustenance through, drinking fluids, okay, depending on, again, what your character's race type is, but you get the idea, okay? Pretty straightforward. Okay, finally we have recovery, okay? This is kind of nice to where if you've got a character that's just been completely overwhelmed for a long period of time and they need the extra sleep, they need a lot of sleep, and you could use that. Again, rare you may use it, but your characters are all supposed to be rugged adventurers and all, I get it, but it is there. So basically with recovery, you're looking at the amount of rest a character needs. If for some reason they're not getting enough rest, then you could apply these. And if you'll notice, on the each race type description, it has the amount of sustenance that's required for each one. So that's something that the architect could use. Okay, so let's see. So as an example, if you're at 75% here for recovery, you're tired. Okay, fatigue starts to set in. Okay, it's time to go to bed. Okay, 50%, you're absolutely exhausted, and all modifiers are 0. So this is a really nice one to use. It's just alone here. You could use that right off the bat if characters have gone through a lot of combat and they've gone through the dungeon for hours and they haven't rested. By all means, you could just put them here. That's your call as the architect, is how to use these. But this is a very nice guide. Okay, same thing here. Preservation. Okay, it has to do with hostile weather, hostile territory. Okay, shelter from the elements. That's what this means. So let's say here, you got a guy who's at 50% of his preservation level. Okay, he's in really crappy weather and he's just getting bamboozled by the elements. He's out in the cold, whatever scenario, or out in the desert, he's famished, whatever, and depending on what you want to portray. Okay, he's at 50%, he's vulnerable. His comfort level becomes stressed. Okay, So back to what we were talking about with ether, okay? His ether recovery would be affected, but also his recovery level here, up here, becomes tired. So that's how, these elements here can affect the other ones up here. So just something to keep in mind here. Okay, so now that pretty much covers it for the sustenance metrics. Again, use them at your leisure, but they're definitely nice to have on hand. And one day you may not use them at all, but out of nowhere you may just decide to throw them at your players, and they'll go, "What in the world are you doing to me?" But again, it definitely works, and as long as you can explain everything accordingly, you might change the things up quite a bit in your session. So, okay, so that pretty much covers that. Now let's talk about the damage system. Now let's move on to the wonderful, pretty accurate damage system that the Glyphs RPG blueprint uses. So on page 276, it's going to discuss the damage system. So basically, just remember something. The damage system takes into account bodily layers, okay, whether it's a character or a monster. So tissue, skeleton, and vitals, each of them have LHP, or localized hit points. So just something to keep in mind. Again, the Glyphs is not about whittling down a creature's hit points unless they have a lot of them, which some of them might, but the idea is to hit the right target and go straight for the vital, or disable it through the skeleton, or something like that, like we've seen in combat earlier on. So the purpose of layering hit points on bodily layers is to reflect that as accurate as possible in a game setting. So just to keep that in mind here. So first, let's talk about structural damage, because that is by far the most common that you're going to see here. So on page 277, it talks about that. So structural damage, we're talking about physical bodily damage to a character or a monster's structure. So tissue damage, skeleton damage, or vital damage, okay? Each of them is layered appropriately with a number of LHP. In the case of humanoids, most humanoids and humans, 2 belongs to tissue, 4 belongs to skeleton, and 1 belongs to vital. That's how they're layered on in different bodily sections, okay? So let's take a look here. To calculate damage, all you do, and again, we've already seen this in the combat demo, but spend your token like we've done a million times, and simply look at the element glyphs, okay? See here, this here gives you the calculations to get your damage. It's already done for you. We've already seen it in practice. So, as an example, you've spun your token, and like we talked about, we look for the most upright or centered glyph, the element glyph, and we read clockwise, and we get a grouping to come up with a number from 0 to 3. Okay? So in this example, air and water, the dots here add up to 3, right? 1 plus 2 equals 3. So, what that means here, see, 2 dots plus 1 dot is level 3 intensity. So that's basically our equivalent to a critical hit. So the weapon or attack damage inflicts a base damage of 3 LHP to the target that it affects. That base damage in turn is multiplied by the attack's damage. So if a sword does T3 hit points of damage, you multiply 3 times 3, okay? The system is very multiplier based, in case you haven't seen that by now. So, again, that's all we're looking at here. Pretty simple. You could read all that if you want to, but I just basically showed you how it works. Very straightforward. If you get a situation where it lands on of fire and carbon, as you see here, then it's superficial damage, okay? We're not dealing with hit points and LHP, you're dealing with MKS. As we've seen, as an example, in the hand-to-hand demo, we were dealing with MKS, or mark damage, superficial damage, okay? So if you see and you get 0, simply spin your digits, okay? And that equates to the mark. So let's say I get that and I spin my digits, and guess what? I land on 5. So that's 5 MKs of damage if I'm using that scenario, okay? And you will come up with that a lot. That's what's nice about having the token system, the damage the way it is, because really you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting any one damage level. And the game changer a lot of times is superficial damage. You know, a guy could be absolutely cleaved in half, you know, attack wise, but if the attack didn't connect enough, and it barely scathed him, suddenly that changed the outcome completely. So that is why that is in there compared to these, and of course you got the critical and so forth. So again, 277, it's right there for you to read, but that's all there is to it, okay? Easy as cake. Okay, finally, again, we already talked about that here, soft damage. Okay, I already went over that here earlier. So 278, we're dealing with soft damage. It just talks about marks in it, or MKS. So 10 marks equals 1 LHP. So a mark is basically it's a subdivided unit of an LHP. So that's when you're dealing with superficial damage. Now, here, 0 through 9 is what we look at here, because the digits here are 0 through 9, right? That's what this here means. Now, soft damage is just like anything else, it's cumulative, okay? So the total amount of soft damage to a localized target, so somebody gets hit, in the forearm or whatever, okay, exceeds 9 marks, okay? If it exceeds that, then suddenly that becomes 1 LHP of damage, okay? So that's a pretty hard hit, but otherwise we're dealing with, 1 through 9 marks in there, okay? Now, what's nice about marks, there's enough to micromanage in Glyphs as it is, or in any role-playing game, okay? Now, what's nice about this that I added in there fairly recently, okay, so to reduce the amount of minutia that the game master has to take account for, okay, the 0 digit here should be really interpreted as 10 MKS or 1 LHP. So even though it lands on superficial damage, if it gets a 0, some architects could say, you know what, no damage at all, okay, let the guy off the hook easy, or I prefer 0 as 10, okay, so a full LHP of damage. So again, depending on how mean you want to be to your victims, but that's one way you could do it, okay. Now also, to keep you from tracking every single mark as they add up, you can just simply round them up. So after the first hit point of damage that's done cumulatively, let's say you spin the token and the digits land greater than 5 marks, just round it up to the next hit point. Okay, you could also do that. You can round down if you want to. Again, that's written here, to rounding and whatnot. That's up to you, the architect. You want to minimize the amount of minutia that you have to track. But this kind of gives you an idea of how superficial damage works, okay? So remember, anything with a T and a number next to it, so like T2 would be tier 2. That's structural damage, okay? That's heavy damage. That's, lethal damage, essentially. Even a punch could technically kill somebody if it's focused enough, okay? And that's a proven fact. Okay, here we're dealing with MKS, okay, remember, less lethal, okay? And that's interpreted by the number sign. So if you see the number sign, the pound with a number next to it, okay, you spin the digits and you take your number that you generated and you multiply it by the number next to the pound sign, okay, if it applies in that scenario. But otherwise, superficial damage, just spin and there you go, okay? Pretty straightforward. I know I'm talking a lot, but really it's so easy. I mean, I get people all the time like, oh my god, this is so complicated, these symbols are scary, like this is just too much. And I'm like, no, it's not. I'm like, stop, just stop what you're doing, take your time and absorb the book, understand what this here does little by little at your pace. That's why I'm doing this, to help walk people through it, and you'll realize in practice just and really how fun it is, and then just the amount of options this system gives you, the architect. So again, just want to show you that real quick and rant about that, because you'd be surprised how often I hear that. It's amazing. So here, okay, real quick, 279, we're going to talk about collision forces. Okay, so if a character gets hit by a vehicle, or believe it or not, your character fails a perception check or whatever and walks into a pole like that, that's what this explains here. So if you need rules that cover that, this is a good page to look to. So I'm not going to read all these in the interest of time. I ramble enough as it is. So as an example, a minor fall or collision damage, okay? If it's a fall, you could say the character had tripped and fell on a rock or a sheet of ice. Okay, whoop-de-doo, okay? If it's a minor collision, you could say the character walks into a pole or gets hit by a shopping cart or walks into the wall or whatever. Okay, now minor fall and collision damage is measured in MKS and marks, so it's very superficial. So use the number sign like we talked about and just spin the digits for superficial damage. It's that easy. Okay, and if you want to measure pain, again, optional, but if you want to go there, it's mild, so they're incapacitated for one quick instant in time. Okay, on the opposite side here, you have a critical fall or collision damage, and the metrics here, and in the middle, you have heavy fall or collision. So, again, nice metrics to use when you need them, but you'd be surprised how often you might want to use those. Okay, so next here, on page 280 and 281, okay, we have some default status elements. I spent a lot of time really thinking these out. I'm not going to go over all these. Take your time, read through them yourself. But they are very handy here. And also, here I just want you to note we have burn damage, frozen damage, and electrocution. Okay, so these three here, you're going to see a lot if you're using like a power or somebody sticks their finger in a socket, which is stupid, but let's say your character does that. I've seen dumber things happen, believe it or not. And this tells you how it carries out through the bodily layers. Because these you're going to see a lot of with powers or, like I said, the environment. But everything up here, like I said, pretty much run-of-the-mill, very awesome status ailments for you to use or add on your own. That's up to you. Okay, so that pretty much covers that. Next, let's see. Let me scroll down here, page 282. Well, let's talk real quick about pain levels and let's see, death levels and the timeline of death. Okay, so pain levels. Pain is an optional metric, but there are cases that you may want to incorporate it. You don't generally want to use it every single battle, just because in the interest of time, you want to keep your combat cycle, your loops flowing, especially if you've got multiple players, which most of us do. I only look at it if somebody gets their arm chopped off or it's something really severe, then obviously you're going to be incapacitated pretty bad. So this here explains the different levels of pain based on the condition that's inflicted, how long your character is incapacitated for, and so forth. So just some examples here. Shows you how to use it here. So take a look at it if you need to. Okay. Next, we have death levels. Okay. So let me scoot over here so I can see a little bit better. My eyesight's not that good anymore. Okay, so death levels. Here, we look at it in a couple different subsections. First, we have unconscious. Okay. That's one, I guess you could say, sort of sub-level of death. The character's still alive, but they're sort of on that threshold, okay? Now, unconsciousness can happen from blood loss and other conditions, or generally, but besides that, through striking forces. So, guy gets just knocked the hell out of, right? He gets his face punched really hard and just gets cold cocked, right? Sucker punched, gets knocked out. Okay, whatever scenario you want to use, that's situational. But if a subject is unconscious, they remain in a coma or deep sleep until they're resuscitated. Okay. While they're unconscious, there is, in this game, a 10% chance of dying per day based on, until they're resuscitated. Okay. Now, this is a new thing that I just recently added. Now, make sure you're using the most recent update of the blueprint, because I do add things from time to time to kind of clarify things a little bit in more detail. I will be doing that for a little bit longer, until at some point I just get tired of it, and I think every situation's accounted for. But generally I do update a little bit here and there, so make sure you are using the most recent version. The date is right on there on the website. It shows you when the last update was made. Okay, so on a KO, okay, it shows you the KO rule here. So during combat, or if the guy gets walks into a tree or something, a KO can occur. Like I said, when striking damage inflicts 5 MKS and up to 1 LHP of damage to the subject's brain. So, if there's no intent to kill, okay, like in the heat of melee combat, and you want to kill this guy, then you would probably use the structural damage versus the superficial. But if your guy's in a boxing match, the guy's probably not going to try to kill the opponent. He just wants to clobber him enough to win the fight. So this basically tells you that it's the architect's discretion, but the rule that you want to consider, the red herring, I guess you could say, is what's the intent to do to this guy. So if I'm just intending to knock him out, then you would use this here and so forth. So that's the fine line here, okay? So like tournaments, accidents, falls, okay? Again, use your discretion, but that pretty much sums that part up here, okay? Next, we have perished, okay? So the guy's body is heavily damaged, but it's still intact. So this guy's very dead, okay? Very damaged, shot up real bad, but the body overall is still intact, okay? So only sophisticated levels of magic or technology can resurrect that character, okay? So keep that in mind when you got a player character that gets killed and wants to run to the town healer, right? They may not necessarily be able to do that depending on how advanced they are. So, you know, if you want to go that route for realism, that's up to you. But it's definitely something to consider. Finally, the third level, we have disintegrated, okay? Guess what? You're screwed if you die, right? Nothing is salvageable. There's no salvageable remains of the character's body, okay? So if somebody's been completely disintegrated, okay, resurrection's impossible, okay? At that point, you'd be like, you know what? You got to make a new character, okay? You may get a guy that can somehow make you justify resurrecting him, and I've seen, you know, scenarios that's happened. I mean, I guess you could make an exception, but they better be awfully damn creative to explain that. But rule of thumb is, if the guy's completely disintegrated, you're toast, you're ashes at the most, and you're dead, you're rolling a character. That's what that means here, okay? And finally, we have the timeline of death. So this mechanic here is very important, okay, if you're going to consider resurrecting a character, okay? So in Glyphs, and again, you can change the specifics at, you know, to accommodate your setting, that's on you, but by default, we look at it like this. So when a character dies, okay, the soul immediately separates from its mortal body and phases into the etheric plane, okay? Now, the Glyphs, or, you know, in other systems or whatever, it's kind of like an in-between zone, like a phantom zone, you know, where ghosts reside, and kind of like a middle ground between the mortal plane and the astral planes, sort of, kind of. I guess you could look at it that way, okay? So it's going to be there basically as a phantom or a ghost, and it's going to look like it did, except in a phantom form, for up to T1 weeks. So T1, again, let's take a look at that. If it's a T, we look at element glyphs, right? If it's a number or pound, we look at digits, but in this case it's T1. So T1, you spin the token, right? I spun it, and guess what? It lands here. Water and fire, right? So that's 1 in this example. So T1 weeks would be, I spun it 1. So 1 week in this example, where while it's in the etheric plane, it can still be resurrected back into its physical form, assuming it's intact enough, right? If not, once that time period is passed, guess what? That character can no longer be resurrected, okay? Again, if an architect chooses to deviate otherwise, that's on them, but they need to be upfront to their players about it. But they need to know, if you're dead and your character's lingering out there longer than the time that you just spun for, then your character is not going to be revived, and it will eternally phase into an astral plane that resonates with its polarity and personality. So if this guy dies and he's not resurrected, he's going to end up in some astral plane that matches up with his polarity. So let's say I spin, and guess what? And this guy was judicious, you know, and his personality was water in this example. He's going to have an afterlife that, you know, that's useful for those traits. So he's very lawful, very good guy, somebody very watery, very introspective type of a guy. And that's the afterlife he would have. Now, if you have a campaign that deals with a planar setting, then that opens up new territory for you to explore, and you could certainly do something with that for this character. But otherwise, that's pretty much how that mechanic works, okay? So that's pretty much all there is to that. Now, finally, let me just touch on this real quick. Okay, let's not go into development yet. Let's just touch on this. So from page 283, 284, 285, it gives you examples of wounds in action, okay? So this will give you an idea of the effect that can occur based on how damage is inflicted. Again, that's only if you want to be very realistic. So if a dragon, as an example, it's only got half of his hit points left, how do you reflect the state that he's in based on the damage? This kind of helps you do that. Okay, so as an example here, again, read it for yourself. I'm not going to read all the charts, too time consuming, but let's say on page 284 we're looking at skeleton, right? And let's say 2/3 of that skeletal structure's LHP are depleted. So 2/3 of this monster's leg bone are broken, okay? So it's not completely broken off yet, but that's a pretty heavy break in the skeletal structure, right? That creature is incapacitated for X counts. X can spin, okay, and interpret the digits. So if I spin it, right, and it lands here, so 3. You could say 3 minutes, 3 seconds, whatever, but generally 3 minutes, right? I would think. So then pain would be severe, prolonged pain, blah, 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 blah. It tells you what happens here to each one based on the damage they get. Again, not every architect is going to go through all that to interpret that level of detail, but again, it all depends on how realistic you want to be and the kind of details you want to incorporate, which can affect the entire the entire experience. So just take a look at that at your convenience to kind of give you an idea of the effect. But I'm going to be honest with you, a lot of people are just going to look at hit points and even localized hit points. I mean, it's very accurate. And I think that's one thing the system does very well, is pretty accurately give you an idea of what a real scenario would look like, you know, barring the game mechanics and, you know, the fact that it is a game and all. I mean, I think it does a pretty good job. So if you want to go into detail as to the consequences of LHP depletion, this is what you look at, okay? So that pretty much concludes our tutorial on the structure chapter. Now, as you just saw a second ago, we're going to move on to character development, which deals with experience points, essentially, how we develop the character and so forth. So stay tuned. Thank you.